Good morning, America.
And good morning to those who need a little more peace and a lot more Christ. My name's Drew.
And my name's Carson. Welcome back to the Peace in Christ podcast. Today we're joined by Courtney Johnson. Thank you for coming on. Would you mind just giving us a short introduction about who you are?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So my name's Courtney Johnson. I am born and raised in Salt Lake City, Utah, youngest of six. So I think when I was younger, when I was 6 years old, I think my influence of the dreams I had in my life were all based on what I watched on television. So I was huge into Super Friends and loved the Hall of Justice. And so I was adamant that I was going to be a superhero when I grew up. And then my other dream came from watching the 1980 Olympics and watching Mary Lou Retton hit a perfect 10 on the vault to win the gold in the all-around gymnastics. And I decided I wanted to be an Olympian. And so process went through it, and I actually was able to accomplish that dream by going to the 2000 Olympics with the U.S. women's water polo team, where we won a silver medal. And then I went to Cal Berkeley and met my husband in the YSA there. And we've been married. We're celebrating our third.
So YSA is not all for weirdos.
Yeah. There were a lot of weirdos, but I found one that's not. So we've been married for about 30 years next year. After Berkeley, I went ahead and went on and got my law degree while I was still training for the Olympics. After I retired from water polo, I practiced for 2 years in law. And then I took about a 13-year gap from professional life while I raised my kids. And I have 4 kids. And now I kind of joined back in the workforce. And currently I am the executive director of operations for Pegasus Water Polo and the director of the women's program and head coach of the women's program.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that with us. So during this year, as you've taught my seminary class, it's been amazing to listen to you talk about the different way the brain works and our body parts and how that can correlate with our spirit and our spiritual side of our bodies. How have you been able to take that and use it with your own kids and explain that with them and be able to almost talk about it openly with them? Because sometimes there becomes like this little gap between parents and kids when they start talking about spiritual stuff.
I think, let me be first very candid and open about this. I don't have any formal scientific training. I do think that I have one of my spiritual gifts is the gift of learning and the gift of curiosity. And so all of this that I found out and figured out through my brain is all on my own. So I don't have any formal academic training, but I've done a lot of research and I've really dived in. The reason I started being so curious about the brain and how it works was for athletics and performance. And so for me, I love water polo. I started a sport where I'm vertically challenged. So I'm 5'4", and the average height for women's water polo at the highest level is about 6 foot.
Me and so we're right there.
Feel our shame. So
Don't remind me.
So because of that, I had to figure out ways of how am I, like, if you look at me and look at all the other players, there's no way I should have ever been able to compete in the Olympics. And part of the reason I did is because I figured out I had to have a mental toughness and a mental skills that could dominate everyone else because I had to make up for my physical. And so how I've used it with my kids a lot is, first and foremost, a lot of my kids love sports. And so I've tried to help them with their mental training and mental skills. And then I'm trying to equate that when they start learning those things and learning those characteristics and those skills from sports, how does that help them in their life, in their future, and in their faith?
Well, I can't think of a better way to approach sports than doing it with God and with those mental processes as well in it. I like that.
Well, and I've worked with my kids, I think I've tried to impart. So part of it was before every game, I would be ready. I'd be on the line waiting to start the game. And I would quickly say a prayer before every game because I knew that if I was going to be successful, I needed to have the Lord by my side. And so I really try to help my kids understand that at all times, the Spirit is always there. So we can call on the Spirit at all times. We just need to ask. And so I think that's really one of the biggest things I try to tell my kids.
Yeah, the Spirit is our single best guide for every piece of guidance in our life. Have you noticed anything that correlates with how we hear the Spirit and with our mental processes?
Yeah. So I think what's really interesting is if you look at the human consciousness for the last 100 years, science has really shied away from studying it because it is so simple and it is so dynamic. So it's hard to figure out what's going on in the brain because it really is your thoughts, right? Your thoughts is your talk. There's not anything between. So we have thoughts. And then those thoughts are always going through our head. And then we go to thinking. So what thoughts we focus on is what we're thinking, right? And then the words we say is how we react to what we're thinking. So much like when we all said, and the thing I find that's words are so important because our thoughts are our words. And I love that in the scriptures, Christ describes himself as I am the word. And I think that's really fascinating because he is part of our thoughts, part of our thinking, and part of our words, which I think is really interesting. And then when you look at the brain, right? So we have all this thing, our thoughts really impact our brain. There was this study done not too long ago where they had someone for 8 weeks, all their subjects for 8 weeks, every day for 8 weeks, they would say a very thoughtful, in-depth, specific, articulate prayer to themselves for 12 minutes. So they prayed for 12 minutes straight every day for 8 weeks. When they did the brain scans, their brains physically had changed in those 8 weeks. So it shows how much what we do in our spirit, because our soul, right? Our soul is our spirit and our body together. So we have to, and we get to take whatever's in our brain with us. So it's really important to focus on thoughts. Like, either of you ever had any opportunities where you've had thoughts, negative thoughts or positive thoughts, where you've noticed a considerable difference in your mental state and your spiritual state?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like whenever I'm in a spiral, I guess it's all about like where the ball's rolling. If I'm in a spiral heading downwards, my mental state can take a drastic approach on how I approach my daily tasks, if I have motivation to get out of bed in the morning and do certain things. But same thing is, if the motivation, if I'm waking up early, if I'm doing things, if I'm being productive, then same thing, or I'm going to be more disciplined. I'm going to be able to go do things. I'm going to be happier.
Yeah, I've noticed as I tell myself positive things like you were just talking about, it's the same thing Drew was saying. I'm able to be very productive during the day. And if I start off the day with negative things, like I have a hard day today, I have a lot going on, then that's normally how it goes.
Yeah.
And going back to what you're saying about praying, a couple of years ago, I actually took that challenge, and every day I tried to pray 15 minutes, and it genuinely does change a lot. I feel like it's hard to stay that way though. Like now I don't do that because I get tired and lazy. But when I was able to do it, I think it really did change my brain.
Well, and that's the part of it, right? Like your brain's constantly changing. That's the neuroplasticity. The neuroplasticity is that your brain is constantly continued changing, and it changes by a few things. You can either develop by learning or by behavior. So the behavior part is where you change the synapses in your brain so that it changes and makes things faster and more readily. So there's things we can do quicker and act quicker. Whereas when you're actually learning things, you can increase your gray matter, which is the depth of your brain, which is so interesting because part of that's so interesting is that it's so important for our spiritual capacity to have brain health. Like we need to take
So if I'm understanding you correctly, the more we learn about Christ, the more capacity we'll be able to have to understand him.
Yes.
Interesting.
And so the other parts of that's really interesting. So brain health, there's this study that shows, so they do scans of all these different things. Okay. There are things that will age your brain faster than it's natural supposed to be aged. So 3 of those things that will age your brain 10 times faster: marijuana, tobacco, alcohol. Which is so fascinating that they're finally coming to realize that all these substances are so bad for you, because the Lord has been telling us since the word of wisdom, right? We have all those things that we've been told not to use. And it's part of it because of our brain health. The other 2 things I think are really interesting, which I think the word of wisdom talks about too, is it talks about sleep deprivation actually ages your brain, and overly processed foods.
I think I need to work on both of those.
But when those are there and your brain health is not good, it's hard for you to be in tune with the spirit, because you don't have the help that you need. So my kids, if they ever come to me and they're struggling in life, whether it's emotional or spiritual, I always ask them the first 3 things. I said, are you sleeping well? Are you drinking water? What did you eat last? Right? Those 3 things are vitally important to what your brain health is. And if you're not taking care of your physical body, your spiritual side isn't.
I've never thought of my spiritual side in that way, thinking back to like, am I getting enough sleep? Am I drinking enough water? But now that you say that, I think looking back, I realize when I have those things, my spiritual aspect is a lot higher. And when I don't, it's a lot lower.
Yeah.
Well, and that's the beauty of the gospel, is I feel like every time I'm learning these new things, it's so beautifully intertwined together on all these different aspects. You know, you look at the symbolism, it all makes sense. And then you look at the difference between science and faith, and it all makes sense. And spiritual side, intellectual side, physical side, it all just works perfectly. It has to make sense.
Yeah. And that's where that all learning. One of the things I think is really cool, and I've been doing this experiment since I started seminary, is I heard about this study about self-hypnosis. And what it talks about is there is this period of time right before you go to sleep where you have your conscious brain's awake. Right as your conscious brain goes to sleep, your brain's still functioning. And that is the time your brain is the most malleable. Whatever you, and I think this is so interesting because and they say, whatever you're listening to, whatever you're viewing, or whatever thoughts you have right before you go to sleep, make a huge impact on what you process and what happens to your brain while you're sleeping. So there's this really cool thing that they say listen to things. So what I've been doing is I've been listening to the scriptures every night as I've been going to sleep. And I feel like there's been a huge difference in my ability to be in tune with the Spirit.
It's funny that you talk about that because this semester in psychology, we've been learning the exact same thing. I can't remember the exact term about it, but talking about how when you're right before you go to sleep, you have that malleable brain capacity, and anything you listen to, you can take in like unconsciously. And lately I've been trying to read my scriptures right before my bed in that same scenario, but I didn't realize listening to it has that same effect.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you think about it too for studying, right? So as people are in finals, as they're studying and trying to take a test, it's really important that the last thing you do is whatever you're trying to learn. Now, the thing I think is really cool about that self-hypnosis and going into that phase is what I have noticed, and I've seen this a lot of times in my life. So as Michael Wilcox talks about the fourth watch God, and he talks about the Lord as being a fourth watch God. And what he's talking about is there's that period of time, that fourth watch, which is from 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. is that fourth watch, right? You've got the 9 to 12, the 12 to 3, the 3 to 6. Mm-hmm. And that fourth watch, they always talk about how God comes in that fourth watch because he expects us to keep working, just like he did when they were out in the boat. Like they struggled and toiled all the way in the New Testament, all the way until Christ came in the fourth watch. And so it's that period of time, and I found it super fascinating that Wendy Watson Nelson tells the story about President Nelson, that when they got married, that he always had a notebook by his bed because in the middle of the night, in that fourth watch,
he'd wake up.
His mind was totally open. After he'd put all that stuff in, he would wake up and have impressions and want to write them down before he forgot them. And I've had that same experience where I've had a really serious question that I've been toiling. And if I say my prayers right before I go to bed, and if I do all the things I need to prepare my mind for the Spirit, there's been a lot of times I've woken up at 3 a.m. with impressions and with the Spirit telling me things that I needed to know.
I've never had that experience where I've waken up in the middle of the night and been able to do that. But I think even as I've been reading my scriptures and had my journal open, that same effect has happened to me where I've been able to recall things that I need to write down, and it's pretty powerful.
And so, I mean, I would recommend, I have a journal with my kids that I, give to them. One of the other things that's really interesting about the brain is it's really important to not ruminate over the bad things. And that's what forgiveness.
What does ruminate?
Ruminate means to keep going over and over, kind of like an overthinking process, where you're overthinking and ruminating on bad things in the past. And so I think it's really interesting that when we talk about remembering, it's a memory recall. But the Lord doesn't want us to ruminate in the past, right? We're supposed to remember so that we can move forward. And I know we talked about this in seminary, but if you look at the old navigation period of time, right? And in the same in the New Testament, they would have navigators that would have these watches over this fourth watch time and period. And basically they would have thousands of observations that they would have to then think. So they'd have thousands of things, thousands of thoughts going on in their head. Then they would have hundreds of questions that they would have to look at and hundreds of questions and things that they would have to answer to get to two things. Where am I right now? And where am I heading? And I think that's what's really important about remembering things is we cannot ruminate in the past. We have to continue to move forward. So we have to know what happened, but where are we now and where are we heading?
Yeah.
So that really is helpful.
I was just thinking, we were filming an episode this morning talking about how as we take those same experiences in our trials, we don't get stuck in the past, like where we take those trials and we say, how do I take them and learn from them and then keep moving forward? And it's hard to do that a lot of times because you want to just get stuck in that like self-doubt and fear and I can't keep walking forward, I can't keep going. But I agree with you, as we continue to make those right steps, that's when our most growth comes.
Yeah. And I think something that you have to be really careful with that I worked with my kids with is there's this idea that's called arrival fallacy. And it's this concept that when we set goals, so this is why 95% of, as we're getting into the new year and resolutions, this is why 95% of resolutions don't work, because there's this idea of arrival fallacy that I have to get to a certain point before I'm successful. And then once I get to that point, if I do it, the maintenance of staying there is super hard. So for diets, especially, right? Like it's super easy for people that are taking diets to be like, oh, I want to weigh this amount. And so I'm going to keep doing the same things. And they have that instant reward about, oh, I'm losing weight. once they hit their goal weight, 95% of people cannot stay at their goal
They
weight.
stop.
Yeah, because they've arrived, right? And so there's this process of our ambition has to be progress. We have to be focused on progressing, continuing for our brain to grow and develop, and continuing to move forward. We can't stop at the rival. So this experience with the Olympics is that, I worked basically my whole life. After I made that goal when I was 6 years old, I found and then I trained for 10 more years after I really started competing at a high level with water polo. So I'm training for 10 years. My whole life revolves around water polo. I finally get to the Olympics. We compete in the Olympics. We win a silver medal. And there's something that's very, very common, and they warn me about it. It's called post-Olympic depression. And almost every Olympian who comes home from the Olympics goes into a depression because
they're at such a high.
You lose purpose. You've had this purpose for so long and you've accomplished that purpose. So now this is kind of this, what do I do now? And so really what I learned from that whole experience and what I'm trying to help my kids understand is it's not about what you accomplish. And it's important to know wherever we want to go. It's important to know we want to get to the Lord. It's important that we want to have that eternal, but it's not about that. It's about who we become. So success is based on not what we accomplish, but by who we become.
I feel like this fits perfectly with, honestly, looking on like a success standpoint. Carson and I have been planning out what we're going to do with our futures as we're about to graduate high school, go off to college. And we don't have exact specifics of what we're going to do, but we do know we want to be entrepreneurs and we want to start businesses and be successful in that area. And the biggest thing that we talk about is similar with what you're saying is we don't want to just start a business and have it take off and then be okay with that. Is what we want to do is we want to, if we have a business take off, we want to do that for a couple of years and then maybe we kind of set it to the side and we start a new one. Or maybe we sell it or we buy one that's dying and flip it around. But it's that same thing is because we know that our personalities, as well as a lot of people around us, is you're going to get bored, you're going to lose purpose, you're going to lose motivation. And once you have that, especially because we have, I can say, speak for the both of us, we kind of have obsessive personalities in a little bit where we focus so much on one thing. And once we reach that level of accomplishment,
We just drop it.
then you shrug your shoulders and go, okay, I did it. Now what?
And now it's kind of like one of those things where you have to have that ambition. Your ambition should be progress, not a destination.
Looking at the scriptures too. When you just finish the Book of Mormon, are you done? No, you go back and you read it again. And in my patriarchal blessing, I've read it countless times. But every time I read it, there's something else that catches my eye that tells me this is something you need to focus on now. And as we read the scriptures, it's the same thing. Every time you go through it, you're not going to notice the same things.
Yeah.
So we can't just stop and say, well, I've read it once, I'm done reading it. God has more to share with you.
Yeah. And it's really important. There's a couple of things that I think is really important when you're reading the scriptures. And this is there's a study that shows that, and it's interesting to see, it's going to be interesting to see how it impacts you all as you get older because everyone's so comfortable typing. But there's a study that shows that the best way to retain information and to have information really stay with you is to write it down, because the process of the handwriting, of actually having to make the letters, is a huge part of remembering and a huge part of study. So just reading the scriptures is a good start, but you're not really remembering like we're supposed to. I mean, how many times in the Book of Mormon does it say remember? It's said because we need to, you should have scriptures that you can write in, right? And that's why the electronic scriptures are great. But if you're really wanting to study and get to know Christ, not just know about him, but know him, you need to be able to remember these things, and you need to do it by writing them down. I know I've seen my daughter does it now because I've done it for long. I haven't told her to do it, but she sees me do it. But I'll be during sacrament meeting or during lessons, I have my church notebook that I'm writing things down. And the thing that's really amazing about it is I started by writing things that the people were saying. But as I'm opening my mind and opening my spirit, as I'm at church, and I start writing down, now all of a sudden I'm starting to write down impressions I have or things that I think of because I'm listening to what the speakers are saying. And it really has opened up it's increased my capacity of learning the scriptures.
I think I can do a lot better job with doing that. Sometimes, you're sitting at church and you have an impression, I'll go write that down later. That doesn't always work. You got to have it right with you to be able to write down those thoughts right then.
And I go through a lot of rabbit holes with scriptures. And when we do scripture study at home, I will only focus on one or two. We'll only do one or two scriptures as a family. And then I'll go in and kind of say, how does this relate to life? Because when I'm reading scriptures, there'll be a word that I see, or there'll be a phrase that I see that I'm like, I wonder, why is that there? Why do you do that? And I'll go down a huge rabbit hole. So one of the rabbit holes I went through is what we've talked about before, is this idea of our brains, right? So everyone has their IQ test that we've talked about. And so an IQ is an intellectual quotient, intelligence quotient. It kind of tries to determine where you are in your intelligence. And so that's what an IQ is. And so then with the IQ, what it used to be in the 90s, up until the 90s, they didn't realize how much of our brain we had the neuroplasticity where it could grow and develop. So it used to be that they thought everyone's brain stopped developing at the end of childhood. And then it's trying to maintain. It goes through our whole life, which is so consistent with the gospel, right? We're always growing. We're always learning, even into the eternities. So I thought that was so fascinating to learn that our brain's still going. IQs used to be this thing, oh, well, IQs can be fixed because the brain stops. So we can tell someone's IQ and that IQ's not going to change. But you can actually increase your IQ. So when they do IQ tests, they do crystallized and they do fluid. Okay, those are the two types. Crystallized intelligence is long-term memory. It's analytical data, vocabulary, and it's just the knowledge that you gain. Fluid is how quickly can you think and act? It's logic and problem solving. How quickly can you do puzzles? So it's this fluid kind of how can you change and continue to grow? And so that's what they really evaluate with the IQ. Now, the thing about the IQ is when they assess the IQ, here are the kind of the 5 things they look at. They look at the ways to increase your IQ. And I think the reason that we'll talk about this for a second is because I think it's really important when you start thinking about your spiritual Q and your spiritual quotient and your spiritual IQ. So you need to look at novelty. Are you open to new things and new thoughts? Okay, so creativity, right? Are you willing to try different things? And then it talks about the other part of it. So you've got novelty, creativity. You have to do hard things. And what they've seen is so some of the biggest problems with society today in that hard ways is 2 things. Autocorrect, because now all of a sudden you don't have to do anything to change your grammar or to change your spelling. It corrects automatically. So your brain's not having to make those changes or to make those adjustments. The other one is GPS. So one of the things they say to really improve your IQ is to start going places without using your GPS.
Oh, I'm very directionally challenged. I know Carson is.
I 100% on my maps, and my mom can attest to that.
So it's one of those things, so there's somewhere you kind of know how to get to, try it. It really helps your brain kind of reset and rethink to have that. So doing hard things is really important. And that's part of it is don't rely on the easy. And that's so consistent with the gospel, right? We have to go through the hard things. And like I talked about in seminary, you have to learn how to handle hard better. Life never gets easier. And Jesus Christ, if you look at his life got harder and harder and harder all the way through. It never got easier. Our lives never get easier. As you become an adult, you have harder things. As you have kids, it becomes harder. And it always gets harder. And I try to tell my kids this, right? You are developing your capacity to handle it better. And then as soon as you do, it gets harder again. Right. So you constantly have to be willing to be comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Yeah, it's a constant battle to reach nothing. You're just trying to get yourself better. I love the line, life's not going to get easier. You just have to handle it better.
Yeah.
And that's true with everything in life, not just spiritually, not just physically, literally everything.
Yeah.
And with the mentality that God won't place any trial in your life without knowing that you can get through it, also I feel like plays a big factor in that. It's like that perspective we were talking about, earlier in this episode, where if you're confident, if you have that spiritual side where you're on that upward trajectory with that motivation, then yeah, it's going to be a lot easier. And then it will get harder again.
And then the other 2 things that they say really helps you increase your IQ is challenging yourself. So there's this period of time in your brain. So our brains cannot grow without failure. We have to fail in order to be able to move forward. Your brain has to know what paths are wrong so it can go right.
Touching on that point real quick, I think a lot of us, including me and probably you too, Drew, we're so afraid of failure because we're scared of what happens on the other side. But I think a lot of times the other side is the growth, not more failure, right? We just have to accept, if I fail in this aspect, I'm just going to learn from it. I'm going to turn around and I'm going to grow and I'm going to fail again. And you can keep failing until you keep growing and it doesn't ever end.
Yeah. And it's just feedback. I really think that's one of the biggest things I learned through sports. And I think sports is a great way to learn it. And I've seen it with my kids is you don't fail. It's feedback. It's feedback to change. We don't fail till we have an opportunity to never fail because failure isn't making mistakes. It's Failure is
Giving
quitting.
up.
So as long as we're getting that feedback and changing and challenging ourselves. So there's this period of time when we push ourselves to the very tip of what we can and can't do, like challenge ourselves to a point where we're pretty sure we're going to fail, and we sit there. It's called deep practice. Deep practice, that's where you start building all those synapses. And really, that's when you take off and have that brain is like that level where you're about to fail, or if you do fail, because then your brain takes a huge leap in being able to correct it and be able to find the correct path. But you have to challenge yourself. If you don't challenge yourself, if you stay comfortable and don't get in that place of being uncomfortable, you can't get past it. So I started running a lot to stay in shape after water polo. And I had some physical goals I wanted to do. And so I was working on those physical goals. And I was running about 3 or 4 miles a day. And I just hit a plateau. And so I started running a little bit farther, and I could not get past this plateau, and I was getting super frustrated. And finally, I realized that it's because I was running at a pace that was comfortable. As soon as I physically pushed myself, so I was slightly uncomfortable, a slightly uncomfortable pace where I had to fix my breathing, where I had to think about my arms, where I had to push myself just a little bit, I had huge improvement.
I feel like that fits back in perfectly to a spiritual aspect of things. There's a lot of times and a lot of prophets who have said when we reach that plateau and stay on it, it's more dangerous than going downhill, because at least when you're downhill, you realize that you're downhill so you can start making your way uphill. But we have so many times that we're plateaued like that, whether it's reading our scriptures, saying our prayers, where we're doing the same things over and over and over again. And it's hard to get out of that. But it's just what you're saying. If we can make that teeny little change that pushes us, can I pray one more minute? Can I not say the exact same thing I said last night? Can I analyze my scriptures better? That's when we start growing more.
Yeah. And Heavenly Father helps us with that, right? So if we get in that plateau and we're super comfortable and we don't make the changes,
There's another trial.
there'll be another trial, right? Or some challenge, right? So like I was super comfortable. I was doing a lot of studying on my own personally. I was in a place where I was going to, just kind of hitting a stride in my spiritual growth and just kind of plateaued a little bit. And then I get called to seminary, right? And so that's a huge, big challenge where it's pushing me in a different way because I was way too comfortable with where I was.
Yeah.
So I think that's what's really interesting. And when you look at all those things, right? So like novelty, right? Being open to new things, to be open to new experiences. And that's where I really think it's that accepting and trusting God, trusting that He is going to guide us and do the things that He wants us to do, even if it's new and uncomfortable.
We take this experience of the brother Jared, we were just learning that, right? And we need to trust in the Lord, but sometimes the Lord is going to give us the opportunity to take our own path and then come to Him saying, this is what I've done. Now come with me and walk with me. And you talked about this in seminary. You said we have like 3 different aspects. We have first where we're going to, what was it? I think walk with Him was second.
So it's like I'm a child of God, right?
Yeah.
Leads me. So first He's going to lead us, right? He's going to show us the way. When we become capable where we're easily able to follow Him, then He's going to guide us, right? He's going to show us the way, but let us start going on our own. And then once we develop into that, He'll walk beside us because we're going on the path where He is. And that's really where I love like the yoke, right? Because once you get to that development and that progress, you yoke yourself to Christ and then we're going together. But you have to kind of gradually get to that point where you first are following and then you're being guided and then you're walking beside Him. And really that is you build that trusting relationship with Christ that He's taking you where you should go.
And part of that journey, I don't think once we get to the yoked with Him, we're always going to be at that yoked with Him. I think sometimes we take a step back or a step down, and sometimes He's there to guide us again. And that's not always a bad thing. It's not failure. It's just change. We're just growing.
Right. Especially if we hit a harder part. Sometimes we have to learn through that stuff. So that's what I think is really interesting. If you look at all those parts, like, because we talked about, right? Like you said, you have to be open to things. But if you're not challenging yourself and you're not doing the hard things that way, then when you're open to things, it doesn't matter because you haven't done the work, right? You have to do the work in order to be open to new things, right? And in order to be open to new thoughts. And the last part of IQ, which I think is super interesting, is network. You have to open yourself up to new people, new places, and new experiences. And I think that's where we come in with that whole united in Christ. And we come as a church and why the congregation is so important and why it's so important for us to be surrounded by children of God and disciples of Christ. So, and that if you do that, so if you put those part of IQ parts into, okay, now let me check my spiritual IQ and see where do I land? Am I doing those things? That's how you grow and develop with your spiritual IQ. So I think that's super fascinating. And then when you go, so that's, to me, I feel like that's the knowledge base, right? That's where we have knowledge. And the next step of our development in our brains and how we can move forward is wisdom. And I think that really comes from emotional regulation and our emotional intelligence. So emotional IQs and emotional regulation, emotional intelligence really wasn't developed or understood until we got to the 1990s. And then they started realizing, wait, there's this intellectual part of our body and our brain, but then there's this emotional part, because it's the whole frontal lobe of our brain is the emotional aspect. So we have to have the intellectual and rational, logical sides of our outsides of our brain working with the limbic system.
Have you seen any ways, as you've been studying all of this, that you can balance your emotional side of things a little bit better?
Yeah. I'll tell you a couple of things that I think is really important. And I'll tell you what I did with my kids. I don't know if they use them or not, but I made these journals called Epic Failures and Disasters that they're supposed to be using. And I'll explain how to do it. But really what it is it's really important to understand that emotions are not bad. Like, we need a certain amount of anxiety. We need a certain amount of sadness. It's important for us. What I think happens is people think, well, I feel this, I don't like this, so I'm trying to avoid it. And people use social media, right? They use their phones if they're feeling sad. They use other aspects of things to avoid the emotions and the feeling. And I think what I would suggest and what I tell you is it's okay to feel that way. You need to sit in your emotions and be okay with the fact that your emotions don't feel good to understand your emotions.
So how do we regulate them when they become too much?
That's where you have to start realizing. So especially as teenagers. So the frontal lobe, which is the limbic part, which is the reasoning and the emotional aspect of your brain, that's the last part of your brain to develop. It does not fully develop until you're 26 years old. So as teenagers, you do not have a connection between your emotions and your logical reasoning. So it's very difficult for teenagers to regulate that.
Yeah, I'll say personally, I've had a huge challenge with, if I get really angry, I stay really angry for a while, and I can't just have a little bit of angry. And the same thing with sad or all of those different emotions. I have a problem with that.
It's really hard. And it's something that as you still, and I think part of it is recognizing it, right? Like when you get angry, you're probably trying to avoid getting angry, which makes it worse because you're not able to control it. It's okay to say, I'm going to be angry for 5 minutes and get all that out. And I'll tell you one of the best ways, again, writing things down, right? If you're angry, write everything down that you're angry about. And then you're able to kind of let it be on the paper. And then that's when you have to move forward. Okay, so what the epic failures and disasters is when something really bad happens, when something makes you really upset, when somebody does something to you or something happens in your life that seems like it's an epic failure or disaster. What I tell people is you write it, and I saw this in a study, is you write it down and then you put a date by it because you think that you failed, right? And so then you come back to it in 3 months and you look at it and see where you are right now. And then you come back 6 months later and you look at that event and see what that event, where has that event led you? And so by after a year of it, you can really, and then you basically have a journal of seeing your progress and growth through bad things happening to you. Because you can see, well, out of this came something else, right? Out of something bad came something else.
It's that objective reflection you guys were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
Think of how cool it's going to be when you have that journal and you go back, let's say 5 years down the road. As a funny comment, you look back and you're saying, well, I'm having trouble talking to girls or in a girl's dance talking to boys.
Yeah.
And then looking back and saying, well, I just got married.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Or because of a conversation you had with a girl, you ended up that be the one you married, right? So you learn and you grow, but you have to recognize that and be okay with it. Like, failure is not a big deal. Like, you learn from that failure. But you got to challenge yourself and you got to put yourself out there to learn from those failures. And that's where you have, as long as your failures and as long as you're going the right way, and as long as you're being led by Christ, as long as you're being guided by Christ, your failures aren't going to be that. I mean, they're going to be something you can manage. Even if it's beyond that, like even if you leave the path and there's always ways to come back. Because like you said, if you slip back, Christ is still there. He's never leaving us. He's always there with us. So I think that's really important to understand.
So then how do the EQ, the IQ, and the SQ all complement each other? Like, for example, if I'm navigating a challenging trial in my life, how can I use EQ and SQ together to work through this trial?
EQ, so we talked about, right, with the IQ, you've got novelty, you've got creativity, you've got going through hard things, challenging yourself, and a network, having a network of people. So they also have different ways to assess your EQ. And it's similar. And that's where I think with SQ, I kind of combine all of those, right? We talked about how the EQ really helps you figure out where you stand with your spiritual growth. With the EQ, the ways to assess it is self-awareness, self-regulation, empathy, active listening, and again, so like socialization or so your same thing, kind of a network type aspect of it. How do you interact and relate with other people? So emotional intelligence is really understanding what you're feeling and understanding what the people around you are feeling is really what the definition of emotional intelligence is.
So what if we have times where we know we're feeling something and we can't understand what we're feeling? For me personally, there's a lot of times where I'm like, I'm obviously feeling angry, but I'm not really sure why I'm feeling angry.
I'll tell you, first of all, there's a couple things you can reflect. I think it was Brigham Young who said, when you feel the least like praying is when you need to pray the most. So when you're having those, even if it's a quick prayer, to kind of see if you can bring your spirit into it as opposed to your emotional side of it. So there's three aspects, right? You've got your spirit that guides you. You've got your emotions that guide you, and you've got your intellect that guides you. So you have to see what is in control at the time. And when your emotions are in control, you have to figure out, how can I get back to it? And it's going to be a little bit different for everybody, but I'll tell you, writing things down when you're angry or sad really helps you first of all, it slows you down. And second of all, it really helps you kind of reflect on why you're angry and helps you figure it out, because that's the part of it is angry. Okay, I'm angry. Why am I angry? Okay. And a lot of times, like where I'm sad, why am I sad? Okay. I always go back to the first things. Like if my kids are struggling, my first thing is, how much have you slept? When was the last time you had some water? What have you eaten? Have you exercised? Okay. Because if we're not taking care of our physical body and our brain health, then we're not going to be in control. Our emotions are going to be in control.
I think that's pretty helpful for a lot of people. Yeah.
So the EQ part of it, it's that self-awareness, right? So the interesting thing about it is there's a study that I thought was so funny is when they talk about self-awareness, they talk to people and they said, evaluate your self-awareness. 96% of people believed they were self-aware. Okay. Only 15% of them were actually self-aware. So you have to understand what it means to be self-aware or have awareness. So it means you have to be aware of what's going on. So sometimes with those emotions, right, you have to understand that it didn't just come out of nowhere that you were angry. There were steps that got you to there. And if you don't have the self-awareness to recognize what's going on with you, that's going to kind of trigger you to get to that point, then you're to a point where it's really hard to pull back. If you get cut off, like you're driving and you get cut off, right, that could start you having that emotion. And if you are not aware enough to recognize that that bugged you, and then you just let it build and build and build, then you get to a point where the anger is beyond control. So it's being able to have that self-awareness to understand. And then self-awareness about where am I in spiritually, right? Am I doing things to understand what's going around me? And am I allowing the spirit to guide me? Because if you don't have that self-awareness or awareness of others, you lose sight. So I think it's Renlund who talks about with the self-awareness that you're going through all these things. And what self-awareness really is getting up to a vista. Like you're walking through a valley, you get up to the top of the hill or to the vista, and you have the opportunity to look around and have that perception. So self-awareness is really being able to kind of separate from yourself and look around, look at yourself inside. So the internal side of it, how am I doing? What am I doing? How am I feeling? Am I open to the spirit? Am I struggling with things? Am I not doing things that's closing me off to the spirit? And then around you, what's going around you, the environment around you that might be impacting you, or how your actions are impacting those around you. So that's kind of that self-awareness that's super important to have.
I love that. As we end this episode, I'd just like to extend a challenge to everyone who's still listening of the importance, as you were talking about this whole time, of pushing yourself to new heights. There's not a single time in our lives that we can stay idle where we'll grow. We will never grow while we stay idle. So I just want to extend that challenge to continue pushing yourself spiritually and physically, emotionally, intellectually, all of those different aspects, to continue pushing. And that's when you'll get closest to God.